They told you that healing would make you softer, kinder, more available. They lied. What no one prepares you for is this moment, the moment when the empath stops bleeding quietly and starts seeing clearly. Because healing doesn't turn you into light, it turns you into truth. And truth is terrifying. You didn't become an empath by accident. You became one because once upon a time, love was inconsistent. Attention was conditional. Safety depended on reading the room before the room read you. So you learned to feel before you were allowed to speak. You learned to sense danger in silence. You learned to earn connection by disappearing into others. And now, here's the part that shakes people. When you heal, you don't crave closeness the same way anymore. You don't chase intensity. You don't romanticize emotional chaos. You stop confusing familiarity with love. You stop mistaking anxiety for attraction. A healed empath doesn't glow. They withdraw their energy, and suddenly, everyone notices what they lost. A healed empath is not a nicer version of who they once were. They are not softer. They are not endlessly understanding. They are not endlessly available. They are something far more destabilizing to the world they came from. They are a quieter threat to unhealthy systems. Because the empath was never weak, only unconscious. Unconscious of how early pain trained their nervous system. Unconscious of how survival masqueraded as compassion. Unconscious of how hyper-awareness became mistaken for love. Trauma does not arrive loudly. It does not always scream. More often, it whispers instructions into the body. It teaches the nervous system what to expect, what to tolerate, what to call familiar. Trauma leaves behind an emotional blueprint, a silent architecture beneath personality, one that determines who feels attractive, who feels safe, and who feels impossible to leave. As a child, you did not choose your attachments. You adapted to them. If love came unpredictably, your body learned to stay alert. If affection arrived inconsistently, your nervous system learned that closeness required vigilance. If safety depended on managing someone else's emotions, you learned to scan faces, tones, silences, to read the room before the room ever read you. This is where the empath is born, not as a gift, but as a strategy. You became perceptive because not being perceptive was dangerous. You became attuned because misreading the environment had consequences. You became emotionally fluent because confusion cost you connection. And slowly, subtly, your nervous system began associating anxiety with attachment. So longing came wrapped in tension. Desire came paired with uncertainty. Love came braided with fear. If affection only arrived when you were useful, compliant, or understanding, your psyche learned a devastating lesson. Worth must be earned through self-sacrifice. And so desire was born not from choice but from imprinting. This is why calm felt empty, why consistency felt dull, why peace felt unfamiliar. This is why emotional unavailability felt magnetic, why intensity felt meaningful, why volatility felt like chemistry. That wasn't passion. That was your childhood knocking on adulthood's door, asking to be resolved. Desire in this sense is rarely about the person standing in front of you. It is about the wound standing behind you. The empath, especially the unhealed one, does not fall in love. They recognize a pattern and call it destiny. They say, I've never felt this before. I've never connected like this. This feels familiar in a deep way. Oh yes, it does, because familiarity is not safety. Familiarity is repetition. Psychologically, what they are experiencing is not a bond, but a loop. The psyche attempting mastery over a wound it never got to finish. This is shadow work's most uncomfortable revelation. We don't fall in love. We recreate. The empath recreates abandonment, hoping this time they will be chosen. They recreate emotional distance, hoping this time closeness will be earned. They recreate chaos, hoping this time stability will emerge from effort. The psyche does this not because it is foolish, but because it is unfinished. The wound wants an ending, but healing does not provide a better ending with the same characters. Healing removes the script entirely, and this is where everything changes. Healing does not erase the blueprint, it exposes it. It brings unconscious attraction into conscious awareness. It makes the invisible visible. It forces the empath to see that what they called love was often survival in disguise. You cannot unsee it. This is why healed empaths begin to look different to others. They appear distant, detached, unresponsive. People say they've become cold. But what is being mistaken for coldness is choice. For the first time, the empath does not surrender their nervous system to earn connection. They no longer fuse emotionally and call it intimacy. They no longer bond through shared wounds and call it depth. They stop mistaking pain for meaning. They begin asking questions that dismantle entire dynamics. Why does this feel familiar? What part of me is being activated right now? Is this desire or is this memory? These questions are terrifying because they interrupt compulsion. And interruption feels like loss. Repetition ends not through willpower, but through awareness. The empath stops repeating patterns, stops repeating explanations, stops repeating emotional labor, stops repeating self-abandonment, and this is when the shadow speaks. The shadow is not evil. It is the part of you that learned how to survive. It remembers the rules. It says, if you stop giving, you'll be alone. If you stop understanding, you'll be left. If you stop absorbing pain, connection will disappear. The shadow does not want healing. The shadow wants recognition. Healing does not exile the shadow, it listens. But it no longer obeys. This is the moment the empath becomes dangerous to dysfunctional systems, because unhealthy dynamics depend on unconscious participation. They rely on the empath explaining, forgiving, enduring, holding space without limits. When that stops, the system destabilizes. The healed empath no longer over-explains. They no longer chase clarity. They no longer beg for closure from those who cannot provide it. They stop auditioning for love. They stop negotiating their worth. They stop trying to be chosen by people who are incapable of choosing themselves. And this creates a paradox that few are prepared for. When the empath heals, empathy becomes selective. They still feel deeply, but they do not merge. They still understand, but they do not excuse. They still love, but they do not disappear in order to be loved. This is not emotional withdrawal. This is emotional boundaries integrated into the nervous system. Attachment theory might call this earned security. But lived experience feels nothing like a clinical achievement. It feels like grief. Grief for the version of you who survived by shrinking. Grief for the fantasies that kept you hopeful. Grief for the relationships that only existed because you were unhealed enough to stay. And yes, people feel this shift. They say you've changed, that you're distant, that you're no longer who you used to be. They are right, because the healed empath no longer leaks energy to prove value. They no longer rescue to feel needed. They no longer confuse being wanted with being worthy. They stand where they are, and let others meet them there or not. This is not hardness. This is sovereignty. A healed empath is not a nicer version of who they once were. They are not softer. They are not endlessly understanding. They are not endlessly available. That expectation, that healing produces someone more accommodating, is itself a misunderstanding of what healing actually does. Healing does not refine self-sacrifice. It dismantles it. A healed empath becomes something far more destabilizing to the world they came from. They become a quieter threat to unhealthy systems. Not because they are aggressive, not because they are cold, but because they are no longer predictable. Because the empath was never weak, only unconscious. Unconscious of how early pain shaped their nervous system long before language was available to explain it. Unconscious of how survival strategies were mistaken for personality traits. Unconscious of how hyper-awareness was praised as empathy, when it was actually a defense. Most empaths do not realize that what they call compassion often began as vigilance. They learn to notice subtle shifts not out of curiosity, but out of necessity. They learn to anticipate emotions because waiting to react was unsafe. Trauma rarely arrives in obvious forms. It does not always come through dramatic events or visible harm. More often it is relational, subtle, chronic. It arrives through inconsistency, through emotional absence, through love that is present one moment and withdrawn the next. Trauma does not simply hurt, it trains. It trains the nervous system to expect instability, to tolerate discomfort, to normalize emotional uncertainty. It leaves behind an emotional blueprint, a structure beneath conscious thought, that quietly determines what feels familiar, what feels attractive, and what feels difficult to leave. This blueprint operates below choice. As a child, you did not decide how to attach, you adapted. If love arrived unpredictably, your body learned to stay alert. If affection was inconsistent, your nervous system learned that closeness required effort. If safety depended on managing someone else's emotions, you learned to monitor tone, expression, silence. You learned to read the room before the room ever read you. This is where the empath is formed, not as a gift, as a strategy. You became perceptive because misperception had consequences. You became emotionally fluent because confusion cost you connection. You became accommodating because resistance risked abandonment. And slowly over time, the nervous system began to associate anxiety with attachment. So longing came wrapped in tension. Desire came paired with uncertainty. Connection came braided with fear. When affection only arrived under certain conditions, when you were useful, understanding, compliant, the psyche learned a core belief: worth is conditional, and conditional worth always demands sacrifice. This is how desire is shaped, not by preference but by imprinting. This is why calm felt empty, why consistency felt dull, why peace felt unfamiliar. Your nervous system did not register stability as safety, it registered it as absence, because absence in early life often followed calm. So your system learned to search for activation. Emotional unavailability felt magnetic because it matched early patterns. Intensity felt meaningful because it mimicked early volatility. Chaos felt alive because it resembled home. This was never passion, it was recognition. It was the nervous system identifying something it already knew how to survive. Desire in this context is not about the person in front of you. It is about the unresolved wound behind you. The empath, particularly the unhealed empath, does not fall in love. They recognize a familiar emotional configuration and call it destiny. They describe it as connection, as depth, as something rare, and in a sense they are correct. It is rare, not because it is special, but because it precisely mirrors an unresolved attachment imprint. Familiarity is powerful, but familiarity is not safety. Familiarity is repetition. Psychologically, what is being experienced is not bonding, it is looping. The psyche attempting mastery over an unfinished emotional experience. This is one of the most difficult realizations in shadow work. We are not drawn to what is good for us. We are drawn to what is unresolved. The empath recreates abandonment hoping for a different outcome. They recreate emotional distance hoping closeness will finally be earned. They recreate chaos hoping stability will emerge through effort. This does not happen because the empath enjoys pain. It happens because the wound is incomplete. The psyche wants an ending, but healing does not provide a better ending with the same people. Healing ends the script altogether. And this is where the empath's identity begins to destabilize. Because healing does not erase the emotional blueprint, it reveals it. It brings unconscious attraction into awareness. It makes visible what once felt instinctive. It exposes how many choices were reactions. And once this happens, the empath can no longer participate unconsciously. This is why healed empaths often appear distant, not withdrawn, but selective. They pause, they hesitate. They no longer move automatically toward emotional intensity. Others experience this as coldness. But what they are witnessing is containment. The healed empath is no longer offering emotional labor by default. They are no longer regulating others to feel secure. They are no longer confusing emotional exposure with intimacy. They stop mistaking pain for meaning, and they begin asking questions that disrupt entire relational patterns. Why does this feel familiar? What is being activated in me right now? Is this attraction, or is this memory? These questions are not philosophical, they are regulatory. They interrupt compulsion, and interruption feels like loss because compulsion once felt like connection. Patterns do not end through discipline, they end through awareness. The empath stops repeating explanations, stops repeating emotional labor, stops repeating self-abandonment. This is when the shadow becomes loud. The shadow is not destructive. It holds the old rules that once ensured survival. It says if you stop giving, you will be alone. If you stop understanding, you will be left. If you stop absorbing pain, connection will disappear. The shadow does not want healing. It wants acknowledgement. Healing does not silence the shadow. It listens to it, without surrendering to it. This is the moment the empath becomes destabilizing to dysfunctional systems, because unhealthy dynamics rely on unconscious compliance. They rely on the empath explaining, accommodating, forgiving, staying. When that participation ends, the system reacts. The healed empath no longer over-explains boundaries. They no longer chase clarity from confusion. They no longer seek closure from people incapable of accountability. They stop auditioning for love. They stop negotiating worth. They stop confusing effort with intimacy. And this produces a paradox that unsettles many people. Empathy becomes selective. The empath still feels deeply, but does not merge. They still understand, but do not excuse. They still love, but do not disappear to maintain connection. This is not emotional withdrawal. This is emotional regulation integrated into identity. Attachment theory refers to this as earned security, but lived experience does not feel technical. It feels like grief. Grief for the version of yourself that survived by shrinking. Grief for the relationships that only existed because you tolerated less than you deserved. Grief for the belief that love required endurance. And others will feel this change. They may not understand it, but they will feel it. They will say you are different, that you are distant, that you are no longer who you used to be. They are correct, because the healed empath no longer leaks energy to prove worth. They no longer rescue to feel needed. They no longer confuse being wanted with being valuable. They stand where they are, and they allow others to meet them there or not. This is not emotional hardness. This is sovereignty, quiet, grounded, non-negotiable. Here is the truth most people never reach. A healed empath is not here to save anyone. That role was never love. It was compensation for an unmet need. Saving others was how the empath stayed connected to pain without facing their own. Healing changes this. A healed empath does not chase wounded people hoping to heal through proximity. They do not bleed to prove devotion. They do not sacrifice themselves to earn permanence. They witness without dissolving. They observe without absorbing. They care without collapsing. They do not glow with spiritual superiority. They do not announce their growth. They do not demand to be understood. They become still, and stillness is confronting. Because when you stop filling the space, others are forced to feel what they were avoiding. Unresolved wounds grow louder around a healed empath, not because the empath is cruel, but because they are no longer participating in denial. This is why healing feels lonely, not because you lost your heart, but because you stopped offering it to places that could not hold it. Loneliness is not punishment. It is recalibration. It is the nervous system learning a new language of safety. It is the psyche unhooking from repetition. It is desire being disentangled from memory, and slowly, quietly, something extraordinary happens. You begin to want differently, not urgently, not anxiously, but cleanly. You no longer crave intensity to feel alive. You no longer chase distance to feel worthy. You no longer confuse longing with love. You choose presence. You choose reciprocity. You choose relationships where your nervous system does not have to perform to belong. This is what a healed empath actually becomes. Not light, not softness, not endless compassion, but wholeness. And wholeness does not beg, it does not chase, it does not prove, it simply stands and lets what is aligned approach. That is not loss, that is liberation.